Today on the podcast, we continue the story of Dick Nunis and the early days of Disneyland. We've already explored his childhood, his time in football, his work in opening the Anaheim Park, and his managerial efforts both at Disneyland and with the New York World's Fair. Today, we're going to focus in on the period of the mid-1960s when Walt started in earnest on the Florida project, secretly buying land and considering exactly what he wanted to build on that parcel. We'll also look at how a few Disneyland employees in Anaheim inadvertently undid some of that planning, pushing the company into a public relations challenge, a connection that perhaps wasn't even noticed by Walt and Roy back during that time. So, if you're driving to work and get your cruise control set, if you're out for an evening stroll and have those earbuds in, if you're cleaning the house and have this playing in the background, that is, if you're ready, here we go. By fall 1964, it was clear that neither Pirates of the Caribbean nor the Haunted Mansion would be ready by the following summer. In Glendale, both attractions were still being designed by WED, and over in Anaheim, aside from the exterior structure for the mansion facade, the land earmarked for New Orleans Square was a set of construction projects. During these weeks, Walt explored alternate attractions that might be added to the park by the following summer. A new attraction was particularly important for 1965, not just so the marketing team could arrange advertisements around interesting additions, but as the coming summer also marked the 10th anniversary of the park, something that the public relations team termed the Tencennial. By November, Walt had a plan in place to expand his park, though nothing nearly as large as the Mansion or Pirates. His best bet was to clone an attraction created for the World's Fair, something that was already designed and engineered, and present that at his park, ideally in a building already constructed. In Glendale, WED, the design firm, and its sister company, Mapo, the fabrication firm, would create a second Lincoln figure with slight updates in the mechanics. At the same time, over in Anaheim, a team would convert an area inside of the Main Street Opera House to roughly match the theater and stage area used for the Lincoln show in New York, along with a control booth where the show's computer equipment could be stored. Beyond this, Walt assigned longtime Disney artist John Hench the job of reimagining one of the park's original restaurants, the Red Wagon Inn, which had been initially managed by the Midwest meat processing company Swift's. They had leased and managed the space for nearly 10 years, and now that its lease was up, Walt wanted to take control of the facility and upgrade its dining room and kitchen. This was part of a multi-year plan Walt was pursuing to expand dining options in his park, moving away from hamburgers and hot dogs, and deepening menu offerings for sit-down diners. The reworking of the Red Wagon Inn at the end of Main Street was one of the first dining upgrades, but it would soon be followed by the Blue Bayou and other establishments in New Orleans Square. Walt asked John Hench to remake the restaurant with designs that embraced a higher level of elegance and Victorian charm. With this, the Disney team had a plan in place around which to promote the park the following summer. For the Florida project, by the midpoint of 1964, Walt had requested that Bob Foster expand his search to create a much larger parcel than the one originally requested. Initially, Foster was tasked with finding 5,000 to 10,000 acres, enough land to hold a new theme park, a few hotels, a campground, and some outdoor recreation areas such as a lake. But as Walt focused in on this project, his plans grew to include other elements, such as an experimental city and a research and development park occupied by American companies. As he was growing older, he looked to projects that might have a larger benefit to humanity beyond movies and other amusements. Walt believed that site planning and construction strategies engaged by Disneyland could be repurposed to create a model city, one that he now wanted to build in Florida. In the months that followed, As Foster acquired land options and later purchase contracts, Walt took key Disneyland operations managers into his confidence. The Florida project was still a guarded company secret, but with deals for large parcels falling into place, he likely felt more comfortable confiding his plans with a slightly larger circle, involving perhaps a half dozen to 10 people. Even here, it's unclear how Walt decided which people to include. Nunis, a small number of longtime operations managers, and Tommy Walker, head of Disneyland Entertainment, were included in these conversations, while other key people, such as Ed Edinger, head of Disney's Public Relations Department, was not. Those included in the conversations noticed Walt's enthusiasm, the way he engaged this project just like he had Disneyland back in the early days. Quote, Walt really liked Central Florida, Nunis said. He thought it was the prettiest part of the state. Walt's conversation with Nunis and others brought them up to date with how the land purchase was proceeding. Some options were hammered out with contracts, while others moved forward with a general good faith. State Senator Erlo Bronson, who owned about 8,500 acres, had verbally promised to sell Disney his land, as he believed the project would transform the region. Quote, We didn't have anything signed with Bronson, Nunis recalled. It was a handshake deal, God bless him. It was a fairly substantial piece of property he owned. Nunis and others were briefed about the new park, the hotels, the recreation area. But there was one aspect that confused them, or at least some of them. Walt's interest in building a model city, which seemed far outside of the company's area of expertise. Quote, I remember Walt becoming a little frustrated and impatient with us one day and telling us we weren't thinking far enough ahead, recalled operations manager Bob Matheson. He wanted us to think beyond the resort. The operations managers soon understood that Walt was far more interested in creating this experimental city than he was with any other aspect of the Florida project. Quote, Walt was not overwhelmed with the amusement park, recalled Bob Allen, an operations manager. He'd said we'd done all that before. He wanted to talk about the city. He'd talk an hour about the theme park and then spend the rest of the day talking about the city. As they were brought into discussions, the managers soon understood the general location of the land parcel that Disney wanted to purchase. At the time, local papers in Orlando were speculating as to the mystery buyer behind these transactions. Though Disney was occasionally mentioned as a possible buyer, more likely candidates were aircraft companies, auto manufacturers, and a company that developed explosives, none of which would substantially raise land prices in the area. The munitions company in particular might even lower surrounding land values if they tested their products on site. As such, land values around the future location of Disneyland East had not yet risen, though they would surely do so after the company made the announcement. The land would immediately become valuable for those wishing to build stores, restaurants, gas stations, hotels, and a dozen other projects used by tourists. As land was still cheap, some of the Disneyland managers worked both individually and in a small group to buy up lots just outside the Disney parcel. Without doubt, some executives at Disney, perhaps including Walt, were aware that a few people at Disneyland were using this information to invest in property. Executives didn't sanction these purchases, nor did they approve of them, but they quietly allowed it to continue. Part of the rationale may have been as followed. Nearly all of the Disneyland managers were young people, many with families, some of whom would be asked to move to Florida. The profits from these small land investments might not only support their families and help them purchase a house in Florida, but might be a goodwill gesture as the company moved into a period of expansion. Still, the operations team didn't have a detailed understanding of how exactly Walt planned to develop his land, such as the future location of the park, roads, and hotels, so they simply made educated guesses as to which land purchases might be the most valuable later. Those who individually bought land would profit based on their own guesswork, while those who worked as a small group buying land collectively spread out their risk and reward among multiple parcels. Everyone understood that they should not talk about their purchases with Disney executives, though it was also understood that Disney likely would let their purchases go through so long as they did not cause problems for the company. Everyone, that is, except Disneyland entertainment manager Tommy Walker, who, like most senior park managers, had been with Disneyland since 1955. Many months later, in 1966, long after the parcels had been purchased and Disney was mapping out tentative plans, Walker put forward an extremely foolish proposal. He tried to talk Walt Disney into repositioning the entry road to his resort so that it would connect with a parcel he had purchased for himself, thereby raising its value. Walt was incensed. He had a number of reasons to respond with anger. First, Walker wasn't trying to change the Florida development to improve its usability or even its aesthetics, rather simply to increase his own profit. Walker had also broken the unspoken rule concerning private land purchases. So long as no one brought this information into the open, Disney executives could move forward as though they were unaware that key park managers were using insider information to profit from speculative land purchases. In revealing his purchase, especially in such a self-serving way, Walker almost surely created a situation in which Walt needed to respond. Walker was soon let go from his position overseeing park entertainment, but this exchange about the entry road and Walker's land didn't happen until all of the wrangling for the land was over in 1966. The problems for that previous year, 1965, were very different than that of one manager trying to manipulate the layout of the Florida property for personal profit. For Roy, the largest problem concerning the Florida development was how Walt personally stood to financially benefit from the creation of a new theme park. Though Walt Disney Productions was purchasing the land and therefore assuming the risk, the park itself would be designed and largely created by WED, which at the time was still owned by Walt Disney as a company separate from Walt Disney Productions. Roy believed that some stockholders would see this as a conflict of interest, a large land deal whose development was partially given over to Walt's private company with a no-bid contract, thereby allowing Walt to profit from a Walt Disney Productions investment. This arrangement might create a public relations fiasco. Quote, "They had to get the company restructured," Disney manager Frank Stanek recalled, before they announced the project to the public. As the land was purchased in secret, without input from stockholders, the company needed to demonstrate that the project would wholly benefit Walt Disney Productions. Quote, "That meant," Stanek continued, "essentially retrieving from Walt's personal family ownership aspects of the parks and the design group and incorporating them into the corporate structure, Walt Disney Productions." The most important element in this transaction concerned WED, a company that was purchased from Walt and his family and then absorbed into Walt Disney Productions in February 1965, just as work was moving forward with the new Abe Lincoln Show and the reimagining of the Red Wagon Inn, a restaurant that was soon to be called the Plaza Inn. This purchase had one other unintended effect. In 1965, for the first time, Disneyland and WED would be on equal footing. Park operations and areas of WED would now both officially report back to the studio, as they were now both officially divisions of the larger Disney company. This new equality may have further emboldened some on the operations team, such as Nunis, to assert their equality with WED designers and engineers who designed the park. On the day the WED Mapo staff transported the Lincoln animatronic down to Disneyland, Nunis went to see it as it was unboxed in the Main Street Theater. The figure, lifelike even when unmoving, sat on a chair and stared blankly across the room. It was a slight improvement over the fair model and would take days to install, particularly as electrical power at the park was difficult to control for the figure's delicate servos. After observing the figure under work lights, Nunis asked the WED Mapo team, "When can we open?" The question wasn't so much an inquiry for actual information, but rather a statement of control. At the fair, Nunis had worked collaboratively with the WED team, but now that he was back at Disneyland, he wanted the WED team to know that he managed the park in Anaheim. One of the WED Mapo team members, Roger Brogy Jr., a man whose father oversaw Mapo, turned to Nunis with irritation. By now, many at WED understood that Nunis wanted to have a larger role in their planning sessions, reshuffling the underlying power structure so that it leaned a little more toward park operations. Quote, "I can't remember Roger's exact words," one of the WED engineers would later explain, but Roger as much told him, "Go fly a kite, get the hell out of here, let us do our work." Roger could get away with that because his dad was the boss. The message was clear, even though the WED Mapo team was at the park. They oversaw attractions until they were installed, tested, and finally handed over to operations. Until then, Nunis and other park managers should simply stay out of their way. The Lincoln figure was installed without further incident. But another, more serious dust-up about the importance or the lack of importance of park managers was developing over at the studio. By 1965, those close to Walt sensed that his health was in decline. In front of cameras, with his hair neatly clipped and dyed, his face smoothed over with a thin layer of base, he appeared healthful and even energetic. But away from that soundstage, executives such as Card Walker, Don Tatum, and his son-in-law, Ron Miller, saw how quickly he was aging. He coughed often. He complained of pain in his upper back and at times had trouble with one of his legs as he walked. Without a cosmetic base applied by a makeup artist, the skin on his face appeared creased and wrinkled, and once the dye faded, his hair was mostly gray, having lightened considerably over the previous 2 years. The problem, the one that none of the executives wanted to openly discuss, was how the company would identify itself if Walt retired or, worse, became ill and needed to step away from his duties. The company was named after him, and he was its one and only spokesperson. Card Walker felt the company needed to have a set of contingency plans, a way to gradually prepare for the day when Walt transitioned away from the studio. As the company prepared a shareholders report, Card Walker believed it would be advantageous to highlight important talent in the company as a way of broadening the face of the studio. Card Walker told Marty Sklar and Bob Moore, "We have to let the media, our fans, and the entertainment industry know that as great a talent as Walt is, he's not the only creative person at Disney." Walker suggested that they include, at minimum, central Disney talent such as Bill Walsh, Don DeGrody, and top animators. The report might also include a few up-and-coming stars such as the Sherman Brothers. But to represent the parks, the photo spread as proposed would only include longtime artists at WED, specifically John Hench, Claude Coates, and Mark Davis, to represent the parks. Though the photos were never used in that stockholders report, the definition of top talent again suggested that, in the estimation of studio executives, WED was more important than operations. This hierarchy deeply bothered Nunis. In planning meetings, Walt would now let Dick Irvine and Dick Nunis hash out plans as to how to best arrange attractions and expansion areas at the park, giving them both time to talk and argue. From these sessions, Nunis believed that there was a tacit admission that his perspective on the park was as valuable, or nearly as valuable, as that of Irvine and other art directors. Still, in terms of company hierarchy, Nunis and the other operations managers could see that Disneyland managers ranked significantly below WED and other power centers at the company. Once more, Nunis worked to balance the power structure on his own and to elevate park managers. For years, Nunis had moved people in operations to other divisions at Disneyland so that he had key people throughout the park, such as in food and entertainment, in essence, reporting back to him. Quote, "This was Nunis's way of doing these things." Early Disneyland employee Bob Penfield explained, getting his people into every aspect of the park so he could eventually take over everything. Nunis now expanded this strategy by transferring his people, when he could, to other areas of the company to work with warehousing, large container shipping, and even project management both at the studio and at WED. The concerns of integrating Disneyland managers into other areas of the company soon took a back seat, though, to a more serious problem that developed for the company. The land parcel in Florida was a massive tract consisting of 3 large purchases along with dozens and dozens of smaller ones. By the spring, Disney had acquired most of the acreage, with those transfers now reported in local papers. For months, reporters in the Orlando area had speculated as to which large company might be coming to their town, with most journalists guessing that it was likely related to Cape Canaveral or the aircraft industry. The name Disney was discussed more than once as a possible place for a theme park, but it never really stuck, as the land parcel in Florida was so much larger than Disneyland. Also, there were rumors that the land, or part of it, might be used for some type of model or futuristic city. Bob Foster, who had been associated with land purchases, never flew directly from Florida to Los Angeles, and company executives, for the most part, stayed away from Central Florida. But then, journalist Emily Bavar and others at the paper where she worked, the Orlando Sentinel, noticed something unusual about recent land sales near the large parcel. Property associated with the large parcel was being carefully purchased through a set of shell companies specifically to shield the identity of the actual owner. Beyond this, some additional people, all of them small investors, had been buying up nearby plots in the hope that whatever was developed would raise land values in the surrounding region. Some of these land purchases were tied to Orlando locals, no doubt speculating. But there was a group who lived outside the state that interested Bavar. Quote, "Land purchases recently recorded in Osceola County," Bavar explained, "reveal that the property adjoining the mystery site has been bought by Anaheim, California money." As opposed to the paper trail for the large parcel, this one was surprisingly easy to follow, with nothing concealed, a trail that, in retrospect, was no doubt tied to purchases made by Disneyland managers hoping to capitalize on the development. The location of Anaheim was enough to interest Bavar in making a trip to California to further explore the possibility. During the summer and fall of 1965, when the company Gulfstream plane was available, Ed Ettinger of the Disneyland Public Relations team flew groups of reporters to California to enjoy the park, meet Walt, and ideally, write a glowing article about their experiences when they returned home. Ettinger flew in these reporters by region, one trip for the Northwest, one trip for the greater Chicago area, and so on, typically with the plane full. But for the Florida-Alabama trip, he couldn't find enough reporters willing to travel with large circulation papers, such as those in Miami and Tampa. With seats open on the plane, he reached out to smaller papers, including the Orlando Sentinel, where Bavar worked. Though Bavar wasn't particularly interested in visiting the park, she was only too happy to accept an expense-paid trip to California, especially as it gave her the opportunity, along with 5 other reporters, to interview Walt. During her second day in California, she was escorted with the other reporters up to Walt's office at the studio. Quote, "We were told we could ask questions," Bavar said. Other reporters went first, asking about films and new attractions at the park. Quote, "When it came my turn," Bavar explained, "I asked if he was the one buying these 30,000 acres in Central Florida. Though Walt had been briefed that a reporter from Central Florida was in the mix, he froze briefly, but then, with a shrug, he recovered and slipped back into the warm tones he often used with visitors. No, he said, I'm not buying any property there. That would be no place to put a park. But Bavar pursued the topic, and as the discussion progressed, somewhat to her surprise, she found that Walt knew specific details about the region around Orlando, including the average yearly rainfall and how many tourists came through the state each year. Another tip-off. Though the reporters were from 2 states, Walt knew the exact location of Orlando, even though back then it was a relatively small agricultural city, and referred to it as being in Central Florida. Once he had answered a couple questions about Orlando, Bavar understood that she likely should move on to another topic, but she also understood that her fellow reporters, all male, would give her a little leeway. Quote, I pursued on the grounds that, being the only woman there, I was in a position to be persistent, she said. He was evasive, but the more I talked to him, the more convinced I became. In a spirit of politeness, Bavar eventually retreated so that other reporters could ask questions about new attractions coming to Disneyland and Walt's experience with the New York World's Fair. But over lunch, as the group sat around Walt's table at the Coral Room, Bavar returned to the topic of Orlando. From his answers, she quickly saw that Walt rather oddly, quote, was familiar with present and proposed highways. He knew there would be a large labor force available as work on Cape Kennedy tapered off. Walt also said that, quote, it takes millions of nearby residents, such as Southern California has, to support an extravaganza. In the days that followed, she wrote multiple articles explaining that, in her opinion, the mystery buyer who had been scooping up thousands of acres just south of Orlando was Walt Disney Productions, with a goal of creating a new Disneyland in Central Florida, a resort significantly larger than the one in California. These articles caught Disney executives by surprise, as they had no intention of announcing their project for months. They needed the rest of 1965 to purchase dozens of small lots connected to their parcel without sending land values through the roof. But those articles did just that. They turned an acre once worth $100 into an acre now worth $2,000. For Disney, it was an expensive revelation, one that needed to be handled quickly. Walt and Roy conferred with the governor of Florida and then made plans to make a formal announcement in Orlando in the middle of November. But in all of the open chaos, Disney executives appear to have never figured out exactly how Emily Bavar came to suspect the Disney company. After the articles came out, most in the company put the blame squarely on Walt, who clearly had given too much away in that interview with Bavar. But what went unrecognized was this. Bavar might never have been on that plane if managers at Disneyland had never bought up acreage in Central Florida, land sales that clearly tied Anaheim to the land deal that Bob Foster had been assembling for nearly 2 years. 3 weeks later, on November 15th, the Disney brothers, along with key employees, traveled to Orlando to make a formal announcement about their plans to build a new resort and theme park in Florida. The event was held in the Egyptian Room at the Cherry Plaza Hotel, with roughly 350 people in attendance, most of them either journalists, business leaders, or government officials. Walt and Roy were the main presenters and offered a vision of a resort area, complete with a theme park, hotels, water recreation, and outdoor activities, with the hope that this presentation, though quickly assembled, might move the project forward. The brothers highlighted the proposed cost of the development and explained the economic advantage of the resort not only to Orlando, but to the larger Florida tourism market. When reporters asked about the possibility of a planned city, Walt explained that, quote, such a city might be outdated before construction is finished. he did admit that he was at least interested in the idea of a model city, one with open areas without traffic. But the key takeaway from the presentation, the idea that would hopefully advance the project, was this: no matter what was built, the Disney organization needed regulatory cooperation in order to begin the project, which of course was a direct appeal to state officials in the room. The seats toward the front and middle of the auditorium were filled with invited guests, individuals from whom Disney needed some type of cooperation or buy-in, from journalists who Disney needed to present their plans in such a way residents saw the value of their resort, to state congresspeople who had the ability to write legislation that would ease the regulatory burden of creating a unique resort and an experimental city. For the most part, this aspect of the presentation went well. As one reporter noted, Walt specifically was greeted like, quote, a benevolent conquering hero. But at the back of the room, an entirely different story was unfolding in the place where Dick Nunis and other company managers were gathered. Quote, a lot of us were standing in the back of the room, Nunis recalled, a group of them looking up at the small stage as Walt talked. Most of the audience was taken with the description of the development overall, as they imagined this Hollywood wonderland being built on swampland near their homes. But the detail that stayed with Nunis, the one that made him more fully understand what was being planned, concerned cost. Walt told the governor the development would require an investment from Disney of at least $100 million. It was an astonishing sum, far more than the studio had spent on any project, especially considering that the land had only cost them around $5 million. 10 years earlier, Walt had spent $17 million to build the entirety of Disneyland. Even now, Nunis knew the total investment in Disneyland was nowhere near $100 million. The figure that managers floated out to the press was that, with improvements and new attractions, Disney now had invested a total of $53 million in the California park, and that $53 million, Nunis knew, was a high-end estimate, something that was generously padded to explain the tremendous cost and effort to create the park. Standing now in the Egyptian Room at the Cherry Plaza Hotel, Nunis couldn't get beyond that figure. It was in this moment that he more fully grasped the grandness of the Florida project, how it would outdo Disneyland in nearly every way. It was then that he saw, with a type of clarity, what Walt had been explaining to him for months: the need to move far beyond the parameters of Disneyland. The one thought that went through Nunis's mind was this, quote, wow, where did he come up with that number? As that number defined the Florida project in a new way, that the company was truly beginning a new phase of its development. I'll be back next week with a new episode as we move toward the conclusion of our story about Dick Nunis and the early days of Disneyland. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. If you enjoy these episodes, if you click in most every week, you can support our efforts to preserve and present the history of the Disney company by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, but the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.